All right, gang, so here's what we're talking about today. We're going to focus today on China in the 20th century, and we're going to focus on the Chinese Communist Revolution, and we are going to look at what's happened in China after the end of their Communist Revolution and what's happened since then. So first of all, in the early part of the 20th century, as we've talked about, there was a tremendous response to outside European influence. Well, following World War I, many people in China didn't feel that their dynasty, the Qing dynasty, was doing a good enough job of protecting them, didn't think that they were governing them the right way. And so what eventually happened was that nationalists overthrew the Qing dynasty. So that ended thousands of years of dynastic rule in China. So for the first time in Chinese history, China became basically a parliamentary democracy. Well, the parliamentary democracy went fairly well for a few years, but it didn't last very long. And the Chinese Civil War broke out in 1927 and lasted basically from 1927 to 1949. And we'll talk about some specifics about that now. There are two sides in the Chinese Civil War. The first side that we're going to talk about is the communist side, and it's led by Chairman Mao Zedong. Chairman Mao was the leader of the Communist Party in China, and the communists in China during their civil war had support from the USSR and Lenin. Now, if you'll remember, Vladimir Lenin died in the late 1920s, and so it left a power vacuum, and Stalin then took over the USSR. Well, the end result of that was that communism in China takes a different shape. Mao was not really closely aligned with Stalin. And while they were both communists, they had very different views. The group that supported the Communist Party in China, just that supported the Communist Party pretty much everywhere else, were peasants and workers. The reason peasants and workers supported the communists were because they promised them land, they were promised food, they were promised a more equal share of wealth. And so obviously many peasants and workers really wanted to align themselves with the communists because they believed that they were going to benefit from them. Now, in terms of their actual base of support, their geographic location, most communists were located in the north. So that was their base of support. So again, the communists were led by Chairman Mao. He was known as Chairman Mao once the communists took power. Mao Zedong, they supported by Lenin and the Soviets initially, and were supported by the workers. On the opposing side were the nationalists, and the nationalists were led by a guy named Kai-shek or Jiang Qixi. Is another way that you'll often see his name. Now, these nationalists supported a democratic-style government. And because of this, following World War II especially, and we'll talk about the difference in that here in a second, following World War II, they gained a lot of U.S. support. They had a little bit of U.S. support prior to World War II, but the U.S. was really kind of playing hands-off and isolationist in their foreign policy, so they didn't offer a whole lot of tangible support. Now, obviously, if the peasants and workers are supporting the Communist Party because they believe that they'll benefit from taking land from the wealthy, the business owners and the upper and the middle class are going to support the nationalists. The reason for that is that they don't want to lose the wealth and influence that they already have as a result of a communist takeover. And their location of geographic support was in the south. Well, Japan interrupted the Chinese Civil War. Chinese Civil War lasted from 1927 to around 1937, and then when Japan invaded, Manchuria, which was the northern part of China, and then invaded further into Nanking, there was basically a pause. The Chinese communists and the nationalists united. They fought against Japanese influence. But the problem with that was that once World War II ended and the Japanese were defeated and removed from China, the Civil War resumed, and it lasted for another 3 years. And the end result of this renewal of the Civil War was that the communists win. The communist forces eventually drove the nationalists out to Taiwan, and that's the reason that we have two Chinas today. The nationalist forces, the democratic forces, were basically forced to flee to Taiwan, and they were defeated there, but mainland China remained communist. So the Chinese Civil War is over. Chairman Mao Zedong is now the head of government, and China is a communist country. They form a solid communist country. So what is Chinese communism like? Well, first thing you need to understand is that China is not the USSR. And so they go about things a little bit differently. Now, they do things similar to what the USSR do. They do run a state-controlled, state government, state-planned economy, and there is only one political party with limited freedom of speech, but they're not as totalitarianistic as Russia is under Stalinistic communism. Remember, I said they were similar, more similar to Lenin's plan initially, but they did not go along with Stalinist communism. So what was it actually like? Well, when the Chinese first took over, and in organizing their country, they instituted what are called 5-year plans. And initially, these 5-year plans were a tremendous success. Industry grew at about 15% a year. You can see that. But agricultural output grew very slowly. But again, it did grow. One of the hallmarks of the 5-year plans were communes. What communes were collective farms. The government took control of all the farms, so there was no more private ownership of farms. And so they collected all these farms. And what they did with these farms is they forced workers and landowners alike to move into these communal villages. Basically, people had to move into dormitories. Adults and families had to move into dormitories and share meals together and work together. And everybody worked together farming the land so that the government could take control and so that everybody could live equally. Now, as you can imagine, some people did not like that. Now, businesses were also seized by the government during these 5-year plans. They were seized by the government, and industrial output grew steadily, though. And so initially, this worked out pretty well. Well, things weren't moving fast enough for Chairman Mao. And so in 1958, Chairman Mao said, okay, we got this first 5-year plan. Now what we're going to do is we're going to institute another plan. And this plan is going to be called the Great Leap Forward. And the Great Leap Forward essentially radicalizes or takes even more demands on these 5-year plans. So they've got to increase industrial output, they've got to increase agricultural output, or else bad things are going to happen. So what happens is that industry actually begins to decline. And the reason it declines is that the government takes more control than it had before. Government takes more control during this. And as they take more control of the land, they begin to export more of the food. When government begins to export more of the food to other countries, that means people within their own country are beginning to starve. The problem with this is that Mao loses influence even within his own government. As the head of the Communist Party, people are like, Mao, you've got this wrong. So in response to this, he backs off the Great Leap Forward. And from 1961 to 1966, there's another 5-year plan where things are allowed to sort of slow down. Now what happens next? So Mao loses influence. Now Mao comes back in 1966. And what he launches next is the Cultural Revolution. What he believes here is that we need to attack the old standards of living. The way that things didn't work before, and the reason that the Great Leap Forward didn't work is we didn't have enough support. So what he does is he begins to attack all the intellectuals. What he does is he begins to attack teachers. He begins to attack people that supported the nationalist government. He begins to attack people that are essentially educated. And what he does is he takes young people, just like, as we've read, just like they do in Cambodia, Pol Pot. He takes young people, uneducated people. He says, your teachers are wrong. Your teachers are teaching you about the old way of communism, and that's not, or the old way of Chinese life, and that's not what we need to do. We need to create a new country in which we are all equal, and we are creating a very different culture. So the Red Guards were created, and the Red Guards destroyed all the old ties to Chinese history. Essentially what they did was they wanted it to be radically different. They wanted radical communism. So the economy they wanted to purge anybody who thought that old capitalism or private ownership was good. They wanted to abolish anybody that disagreed with them politically. And again, they used young people to do this. And one of the things that these Red Guards carried around with them was this little book right here. It's called the Little Red Book. Okay, you can see it right there. The Little Red Book. It was Mao's Little Red Book that he wrote. And it was just a book of sayings. Well, Chairman Mao began to get old. And Mao lost favor because of this Cultural Revolution. And the reason he lost favor was that there was civil war that was being threatened. And so they almost lost. The people were almost overthrowing the government. And the government realized, no, we can't do this. We've got to retain power. And so after Mao, what happened next was two guys took control. Zhou Enlai, which you guys have read about, and another guy named Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping really radically changes communism in China. And what begins in the 1970s, early 70s, is an open door policy. Chairman Mao is still in power, but what he realizes is, hey, we need to have a closer relationship with the West. And so here's how this relationship evolves. So China no longer really supports communist Russia. They don't really communicate with them, and there's some really bad relationships between China and the West. Well, Richard Nixon and the Chinese get together, and they believe that the West and China can work together, even though China is communist. And so the first step in this is what's called ping-pong diplomacy. And this ping-pong diplomacy essentially argues for the support of using ping pong, which is a tremendously popular sport in China, to develop closer relations. And that works out pretty well. Well, the next guy coming into power is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping comes in 1978 and is basically in control of government from 1978 until his death in 1972, or 1992 rather. And he is, again, very welcoming to the West. And so here are a couple of things that he does, and he's best known for what's known as the four modernizations. So modernization takes place in four aspects of life. Number one aspect is agriculture. And the result is allowing, basically all these four modernizations allow more free enterprise, more private ownership, and more freedom in a lot of different aspects of their economic life. So the first part is agriculture. Their agricultural output increases by 50% under the four modernizations in the 1980s. So they're producing more food. And what producing more food means is that more people are being able to eat, which also means that they have more people exporting to the West. And so that gives them another source of wealth. Industry is probably the most important result of this. And it's at this time that we begin to see in the 1980s made in China. It's at this point that Western companies begin buying up factories in China. And Western companies are allowed into China, and they use the cheap Chinese labor to produce their goods. That's why so much of our stuff is made in China today, is because of Deng Xiaoping's opening to the West and open door policy to the West. They also modernize in defense. China begins to modernize and develop nuclear weapons on their own. And they also modernize in technology, developing a space program. What does all this mean for China? All this means for China a tremendous increase in gross domestic product, a tremendous increase in the standard of living for their people. And so people are wealthier, people have a higher standard of living, people have more money. And now China in the late 80s and into the 1990s is beginning to emerge as a major world power. And that lays the groundwork for why China is such a strong influence on the world today. Now, what happened in the 1980s as a result of this Western influence, Western companies being allowed in? Well, in 1989, just like in the rest of the world, people began to protest for democracy. Students especially began saying, hey, we want more of a voice in government. We want more freedom in our government. And these protests took place at a place called Tiananmen Square. Right there, you can see that. And at Tiananmen Square, students staged a sit-in where they complained about communist control of freedom of the press, limits on freedom of speech, and they protested that. And these came to a head with a guy who protested and went and stood in front of tanks. But the problem was lots of the protesters were killed. Eventually, the protest dissolved and communism remained in power. The important thing to remember about China is that they do now have a mixed economy with less state planning or less government planning and communism economically. But politically, China is still a communist country, politically, still controlling a lot of the say in government that people have, limiting the say in government that people have, as China remains a communist government. So in this video, we saw the Chinese Revolution as it took place in the struggle between the civil war between the communists and the nationalists. Communists led by Chairman Mao, the nationalists led by Deng Xiaoping. And then we saw Chairman Mao's programs, the 5-year plans, and how they formed communes. And then we also saw the Great Leap Forward as his program and how it led to some famine. We saw his Cultural Revolution and the Red Guards and how that eventually failed. And then we saw Deng Xiaoping and his 4 modernizations that wound up resulting in the Tiananmen protest in 1989. But still, we see communism is still in control. All right, I hope you guys have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow.